Good day, everyone. So, in this video, I will be talking about the motor and extrapyramidal system. So, why do we have to study the motor system? Number one, since we are studying physical therapy, mobility is our specialty. So, we have to be very familiar with how movement is being produced. So, we're done with the somatosensory system, which tackles about sensory input. Now we go to the counterpart of it, which is the motor system. This one is how we are able to move our body. And again, this is due to hierarchy of different structures in our brain that works together in order for us to be able to perform a smooth, coordinated movement. So, it is an organized, complex, and hierarchy organization of different structures within our brain, such as the spinal cord, the brainstem, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. So these are the structures that we will be discussing as we go along in this video. So in this slide, you can see already the summary of the motor system. It starts with the upper motor neuron. Now, going back with your somatosensory system, remember there are three neurons that are needed for us to be able to transmit sensory input from our body or from the external environment going towards the brain, and that is your three order neuron, remember? So the first order neuron is found within the dorsal root ganglion, and the second order neuron is found within the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and lastly, the third order neuron is found within the thalamus. So in the motor system, which is the counterpart of your somatosensory system, we also have neurons, but in this system, we only have two. Again, those are your upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So let's start first with the upper motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron, this is located again in the cortex, in the brain, specifically in your primary motor cortex. It makes sense because this is the motor system. This is your also known as your Brodmann area 4, primary motor cortex. From there, it will project downwards towards the brainstem. So the brainstem is divided into three parts. You have the midbrain rather, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, there would be a tract there. There's a specific structure there where specifically the corticospinal tract will pass through, and it will not just pass through there, but it would also decussate towards the opposite side. And that's why our brain controls the contralateral side of our body. It's because of the decussation of the corticospinal tract within the pyramids of the medulla. So the structure that I was pertaining to is the pyramids of medulla. It is where specifically the tracts of the corticospinal will pass through going towards the spinal cord. Now, where is the second neuron, the lower motor neuron? So this neuron is found within the spinal cord, specifically at the interneuron and the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. From the name itself, these cells or neurons are found in the anterior portion of the spinal cord, specifically in the anterior horn. That's why it's called the anterior horn cells. Now, this is the point where the upper motor neuron or the fibers that will synapse in the spinal cord is now considered a lower motor neuron. Again, this is the point where it starts to become a lower motor neuron. What is that again? That's your anterior horn cells. So that's the second motor neuron. Next, if you look at this picture in the slide, we can tell that there's a lot of structures within our brain that helps and that has a role in producing movement. For us to be able to have a smooth, coordinated, and skillful movement, we need to recruit not just the primary motor cortex, but we need the help of other structures in our brain, such as the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. So the cerebellum, it's a very important structure in coordination. That's what I want you to remember in the function of cerebellum. It's the primary structure that is needed for us to be able to do coordinated movements. When we say coordinated movements, this is our ability to be able to move in reciprocating manner, in alternating ways, for example pronation and supination, and also rhythmic movements. This is under your coordination. The basal ganglia, on the other hand, is very important for gating proper initiation of movement. So when we say gating, it's like modulating. The basal ganglia is able to either inhibit or facilitate the certain or appropriate muscles needed for us to, in a specific skill. For example, if we need to stand up, so from sitting, we're going to stand up. It's the basal ganglia's role is to inhibit those muscles that are not needed in that task. So let's look at the knee, for example. So when standing up, the muscles that we need to recruit in the knee should be the knee extensors, and the knee flexors, on the other hand, should be relaxed. So it's the job of the basal ganglia to facilitate or to tell our brain that only the knee extensors should be facilitated while the knee flexors should be inhibited. That is the key role of basal ganglia. It's to modulate the activity of other muscles that are both needed and not needed during a task or during a movement. And so the end result still would be coming from the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, because it's the one that will send the appropriate response or movement to the effector organ. When we say effector organ, these are the muscles that are innervated by the lower motor neurons, which are needed to contract to produce a movement. Okay, so again, the basal ganglia, it's very important for modulation of movement. Cerebellum, important for coordination and even balance. Balance is also a function of the cerebellum. Right. So aside from the motor system, as you can see, the sensory system also plays a role in movement. And that is because we have special cells, receptors, that detects whether or not we need to respond or to give our brain an idea on the position of our body. That's the function of the sensory system, especially those receptors that are found inside our body called the proprioceptors, right? So these receptors will help detect if there's movement needed in our body for us to be able to respond correctly. And then they will send the input to the lower motor neuron. From there, the lower motor neuron will now send that impulse via the ascending pathway that we have discussed last topic under somatosensory system. And the next is the brainstem. So the brainstem, remember during your prelims, we have very important centers that are found within the brainstem, such as the respiratory centers found within the medulla and the pons. But aside from respiration, we also have the basic movements, the control centers for posture found within the brainstem. So the brainstem is very important because it contains a lot of centers that are important in our day-to-day activities. So I just want you to also remember that aside from the tracts passing through the brainstem, one of its important as well is that it also contains the centers that are needed, that are vital for our survival and for our movement. And lastly, we have the skeletal muscles. These are voluntary muscles that needs command from the higher cortex, which is specifically, again, the primary motor cortex. And that these are the structures, the organs that will allow the execution of the movement that we want to perform. So I have already mentioned the two motor neurons, and let's just recap their locations. So the upper motor neuron, these are again found within the central nervous system. And when we say central nervous system, this includes the brain and the spinal cord. But there's a specific area in the spinal cord that divides the two motor neurons. So the upper motor neuron again will start from the cortex, primary motor cortex. It will also pass through the internal capsule. We'll discuss that as we go along in this discussion. And then it will also pass through the brain stem. That's why your corticobulbar tract is still considered under your upper motor neuron, because the corticobulbar tracts will pass through the upper motor neuron pathway and will also project towards the pyramids of the medulla. That's why it's still considered under upper motor neuron. And then lastly, in the spinal cord, before it synapse with the interneuron found within the spinal cord. Okay, so that is the upper motor neuron. Next would be the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron, this is also found within the spinal cord. The only difference is the location, the specific location in the spinal cord. So that location is the anterior horn cells that are found within the spinal cord. From there, it will project its fiber towards the skeletal muscles or the effector organs, and that will be the lower motor neuron system. Okay, so if there's a lesion in the brain, would you consider it under upper motor neuron lesion or lower motor neuron lesion? So the answer is upper motor neuron lesion, because the brain contains still the upper motor neuron pathway. Okay, and if you have a lesion in the peripheral nerves that are innervating a skeletal muscle, say for example, the radial nerve, you have a lesion or damage to the radial nerve, do you consider it under upper motor neuron lesion or lower motor neuron lesion? The answer is lower motor neuron lesion, because the peripheral nerve, radial nerve, is already a projection from the anterior horn cell going towards the muscles that it innervates. So I hope you understand the difference between the two motor neurons in the motor system. Now, these are the tracts that are part of your motor system. These are descending pathways to the spinal cord, and they carry efferent information. So it means motor information. The first one would be the corticospinal tract, which is our primary pyramidal tract. And then we have the extrapyramidal tracts. These are your reticulospinal tract, tectospinal, rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and the olivospinal tract. Now, the descending autonomic fibers, these are part of the autonomic nervous system, and we will not be discussing this under this discussion. Okay, so we'll start with the corticospinal tract. But before that, let us differentiate first pyramidal system versus extrapyramidal system. Now, when we say pyramidal system, these includes the two descending tracts, which are the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. Again, those are the only tracts that are under pyramidal system, and they are called the pyramids because they are the only tracts that will project in the pyramids of medulla. That's the only reason why they are named that way. Okay, again, it's only the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. Next is the extrapyramidal tract. So from the name itself, extra, it's outside the pyramids. So these are tracts that will not project or will not pass through the pyramids of medulla. Instead, they will have their own pathway. Okay, and we'll discuss that later. So next is differentiating voluntary versus automatic movements. So when we say voluntary movements, these are under our own command. These are consciously controlled by our own brain. If we want to move or lift our finger, that's voluntary. When we say automatic movements, these are not necessarily involuntary, like smooth muscle, like in the smooth muscle system, but automatic to a sense that we do not have to constantly think about it anymore, because our body is so used to it that it's automatically being performed by our body. Example na lang would be your walking. Walking is a great example of an automatic movement, because when we walk, we don't even realize that we're swaying our hands or our arms, right? And that's because of the function of the extrapyramidal system. Just like your basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. That's why we also have to discuss them because they really are important in movement. And lastly, the motor system. We have simple, basic voluntary movements that are being executed. However, these are not only performed or commands coming from the primary cortex only, but instead it's a connection, or it's a combination of different structures found within the brain, and those are again your basal ganglia, cerebellum, and the brainstem. So, the pyramids of Medulla. Let's just go back to the anatomy of the brainstem. So, in this picture, you can see the midbrain. We have the midbrain here, the midbrain, the pons, and then the most inferior part of the brainstem would be the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, the highlighted green area is your pyramids of the medulla. So that is the area where the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract will project towards. That's why they are under the pyramidal system of the descending tracts. Okay. Now, I've also written here that the lateral fibers of the corticospinal tract will decussate at pyramids of medulla, and I want you to remember that. Okay, and it's the reason why the pyramids, or rather, the our primary motor cortex controls the opposite side of our body. Again, it's because of this decussation of the corticospinal tract, specifically the lateral fibers, because the corticospinal tract has two fibers. There's an anterior fiber and there's the lateral fiber. So the lateral fiber will be the fibers that will cross over towards the opposite side. There's like 90% of the corticospinal tract are lateral fibers. Only 10% are anterior corticospinal tract. So in a way, it's still majority of the corticospinal tract will still decussate towards the opposite side. Now, this shows us the extrapyramidal tracts. As you can see, they did not pass through the pyramids of the medulla. Instead, they have different pathways. Some of them will go to the olives of the olives of the medulla. Some of them only within the brainstem. Some of them only within the brain itself. So it depends. And the thing is, they will not pass through the pyramids. That's why, again, they are not under pyramidal system. Instead, they are called the extrapyramidal tracts. So here's a picture of a clearer picture showing you the different different tracts of the extrapyramidal and pyramidal tracts in our body. Next, we have the corticospinal tract. Again, this is our primary pyramidal tract. It originates in the sensory motor cortex, specifically in the primary motor cortex, Bronmann area 4. From there, it will project towards the brainstem, specifically at the medulla, because it is the site where it will decussate towards the opposite side, specifically in the pyramids of medulla. And that's why, again, the right brain will control the left side of our body. It's because of the decussation of the corticospinal tract in the pyramids of medulla. Next, the corticobulbar. So the corticobulbar, similar with your corticospinal tract, it will originate from the cortex, the primary motor cortex. However, the difference is that it will end only within the brainstem, but still it is part of your pyramidal system. It will pass through the internal capsule just like your corticospinal tract, and then it will end within the nuclei found in the brainstem. So some of them are somatic and some of them are for the facial muscles. Okay, now we're done with the pyramidal system. Let's proceed with the extrapyramidal system. So the extrapyramidal system, this includes the corpus striatum, subthalamic nucleus, substantia nigra, red nucleus, and the brainstem reticular formation. So these are like nuclei that are found within the brainstem, the brain, and even the spinal cord that are acting in the extrapyramidal system. Again, the importance of extrapyramidal system is to provide smooth coordinated movement and to modulate our in the execution of our movement. So here's another picture. I think this is an MRI showing the different structures that are that comprises the extrapyramidal system. So the caudate nucleus, these are structures found within the basal ganglia. Internal capsule, we'll discuss this later, but this is basically a structure that is composed of fibers. So these are only motor fibers. No, they were formed because of the bundles of motor fibers that are passing through this area. That's the internal capsule. Then we have the lentiform nucleus. This is also part of the basal ganglia. We'll discuss this later. The nucleus basalis, the temporal lobe, and then we have the insula, which is oftentimes an underappreciated fifth lobe of our brain, the insular lobe. Again, these are the extrapyramidal tracts: your reticulospinal, tectospinal, cerebrospinal, vestibulospinal, and lastly, the olivospinal tract. We'll start with the reticulospinal tract. Now, this table already contains the summary of what I'll be discussing in a while. So if you want a quick review or recap of the extrapyramidal tracts and the pyramidal tracts, just look at this table and you already have all of its information. So now let's start with the reticulospinal tract. Reticulospinal tract, so from the name itself, it starts from the reticular formation. The reticular formation, this is found within the brainstem. This has been discussed during your prelims, but we discussed this as not part of the motor system, but we talked about its function with alertness and consciousness. That's why, if you remember, if you have a damage or a lesion in the brainstem, one presentation could be comatose. A person can undergo comatose, unconsciousness. They can become unconscious because of the reticular formation being compromised when you have a damage in the brainstem. But another function of your reticular formation, aside from that, is for modulation of movement. Specifically, it influences voluntary movements and reflex activity because the reticulospinal tract, it kind of paves a way for the hypothalamus to have a connection with the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, this is very important. It's almost like a reflex way of our body to protect ourselves. It's for fight or flight or for rest and digest, right? So the reticulospinal tract helps the hypothalamus to have a connection with specifically the sympathetic outflow and the sacral parasympathetic outflow. That's why there are certain movements that are being generated when we are under an autonomic nervous response. Next is the tectospinal tract. So I hope you remember the word tectum. So it rises from the superior colliculus, which is found within the tectum of the midbrain. And you can see that this is important for reflex postural movements in response to visual stimuli. If you remember in the cranial nerve topic, we have mentioned superior colliculus there because the pathway of the optic nerve will synapse with the superior colliculus. So it means that there's a connection between the visual system and our reflexes that are happening or that are a response of our body. And that's because of the superior colliculus. And because of the tectospinal tract, we are able to move our body in response to visual stimuli. One example of this reflex is when we're crossing the street, and for example, a car suddenly passes by, and it's our instinct to look at the car, even though we weren't looking at it while we're crossing over. But because of that visual stimuli, our body is able to halt and stop us from moving forward because we know that it's not safe. So that's kind of like the example of the tectospinal tract. Again, It is for reflex postural movements pertaining to visual stimuli. One way for me to remember this tract is that it sounds like neck. The tectum sounds like neck for me, and I remember this, that whenever there's a visual stimuli, we move our neck, right? We move our neck towards the stimulus. So if we see a red balloon, we look at the red balloon, we move our neck. So that's one way for me to remember the tectospinal tract. Again, this originates from the tectum of the midbrain, and then it will synapse within the spinal cord. Next is the rubrospinal tract. So rubro means red. And so the origin of the rubrospinal tract is from the red nucleus, and this is found within the tegmentum of the midbrain. So kanina, we discussed the tectospinal tract coming from the superior colliculus, found within the tectum of the midbrain. Now we have the red nucleus, which is found within the tegmentum of the midbrain. If we go back to the anatomy of the midbrain, it can be divided into three parts. You have the anterior, middle, and posterior part. The anterior part of the midbrain is called your crus cerebri, or the basis of the midbrain. The middle portion is called the tegmentum of the midbrain. The way I remember this is there's letter M in the tegmentum, and it stands for middle of the midbrain. And then lastly, the posterior part of the midbrain is where the tectum is located. Okay? Now again, the rubrospinal tract, just like your reticulospinal and the tectospinal tract, this is part of the extrapyramidal system that is important for modulation of movement. Specifically, it facilitates flexor muscles while it inhibits extensor muscles. So, for example, we need to lift a glass of water because we're about to drink it. So the muscles that are needed to be recruited would be in the elbows, the elbow flexors, to bring the cup towards our mouth. And the function of the rubrospinal tract, for us to be able to execute a smooth and appropriate movement, is to inhibit the extensor, the elbow extensors, so that we can smoothly bring the cup towards our mouth without spilling the water. Because if the elbow extensors are not inhibited, we will then have a shaky way of moving our hand towards our mouth. And so thankfully we have the rubrospinal tract to inhibit the extensor muscles while facilitating the flexor muscles. Again, the rubrospinal tract, it facilitates flexion while it inhibits extension. I am emphasizing this because there's another tract that will do the opposite of this, and that is the next tract, which is the vestibulospinal tract. So, the vestibulospinal tract, it will start from the vestibular nuclei, which is found within the pons, and the medulla beneath the floor of the fourth ventricle. And this one is the opposite of the rubrospinal tract, because in this tract, it facilitates not the flexor but the extensor muscles while it inhibits the flexor muscles. Okay, and this is also the reason why the vestibulospinal tract is important for posture, because when we're standing up, what muscles do you think is being more recruited in the trunk? Is it the extensor muscles or the flexor muscles? Of course, it's the trunk extensors, because we need to stand erect. And so that is also the reason why vestibulospinal tract is very helpful for our posture, because it facilitates extensor muscles while it inhibits flexor muscles. So imagine if there's no inhibition of our abdominals, we would be shaking, we would be moving our body forward and backwards if there's no inhibition of the abdominals. So that is the function of the vestibulospinal tract. And lastly, we have the olivospinal tract. So this is thought to arise from the inferior olivary nucleus and to descend in the lateral white column of the spinal cord. If you remember in the spinal cord topic, the lateral white column, this one has a function with autonomic nervous system. So the olivospinal tract, in a way, has also a connection with the reflexes or autonomic nervous system. But aside from that, some references, they say that it influenced the activity of the motor neurons in the anterior gray column. However, there are a lot of references that are doubting it even exists. So that's the olivospinal tract. So, in summary, the corticospinal and the rubrospinal system appears to cooperate to control hand and finger movement. Again, what is the function of the rubrospinal tract? It is to facilitate flexor muscles. So, the rubrospinal tract appears to play a role in controlling of the flexor muscle tone. I think this is specifically to hands and fingers, fine motor control, while the reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and tectospinal systems play a limited role in movement of the extremities. Instead, their main influence is on the musculature of the trunk, mostly for posture, specifically the vestibulospinal tract. Okay, so this is the summary of the extrapyramidal and the pyramidal system. Now, let's watch this video. This is a nice visualization of the motor system.
In order for you to flex your bicep in the mirror, your brain and brainstem has to send a motor signal through the spinal cord to the muscles in the body. These motor signals are carried through two tracts, the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal tracts. Neurons in the pyramidal tract are composed of upper motor neurons that directly innervate lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Neurons in the extrapyramidal tract do not directly innervate lower motor neurons, but instead help coordinate muscle movement by indirectly activating or inhibiting groups of lower motor neurons through interneurons. These groups of lower motor neurons usually innervate multiple muscles that share the same function, usually either flexors or extensors. The pyramidal pathway is the primary pathway that carries out motor commands for voluntary movement, and it can be broken down into the two main tracts, the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. The corticospinal tract originates in the motor cortex, where the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons are located. The axons of these neurons travel together as fibers through the internal capsule to reach the brainstem, where they form the medullary pyramids on the ventral surface of the brainstem. At the level of the medulla, these fibers divide, and 90% of them form the lateral corticospinal tract, which cross over to the opposite side of the medulla at the pyramidal decussation, while the remaining 10% of them form the anterior corticospinal tract, which does not cross over just yet, and both tracts then travel through the spinal cord. Neurons from the lateral corticospinal tract synapse on lower motor neurons in the anterior horn, while the neurons in the anterior corticospinal tract cross over in the spinal cord first before they synapse on the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn. The lateral corticospinal tract controls the muscles of the limbs, while the anterior corticospinal tract controls those in the trunk. The corticobulbar tract also starts in the motor cortex, where the upper motor neurons are located. The axons of these upper motor neurons form the corticobulbar tract, which travel lateral to the corticospinal tract to reach the brainstem. These axons will depart the tract and synapse directly with the contralateral lower motor neurons for cranial nerves 5, 7, 11, and 12, at their corresponding levels of the pons and medulla. Some of the upper motor neurons branch into two fibers which synapse with both the ipsilateral and contralateral motor nuclei. These include cranial nerves 5, which controls the muscles for chewing, 11, which controls the muscles of the neck, and the part of 7 that innervates the muscles in the upper half of the face. This means that muscles innervated by these nerves receive motor signals from the motor cortex from both hemispheres of the brain. The upper motor neurons of cranial nerve 7 that control the lower half of the face, and cranial nerve 12, which control tongue movement, cross over in the brainstem without branching and only synapse with the contralateral nuclei. So the muscles innervated by these cranial nerves only receive motor information from the contralateral cerebral cortex. In contrast to the pyramidal tracts, the extrapyramidal tracts do not start in the cerebral cortex. Instead, their upper motor neurons are located within nuclei in the brainstem, and they send their axons down the spinal cord. These tracts include the pontine reticulospinal tract, medullary reticulospinal tract, the lateral vestibulospinal tract, and the rubrospinal tract. The pontine or medial reticulospinal tract and the medullary or lateral reticulospinal tract help coordinate movement and posture. The reticular formation is a network of nuclei that are found throughout the brainstem. Reticular nuclei in the pons gives rise to the pontine reticulospinal tract, which travels ipsilaterally through the ventral medial portion of the spinal cord, where they act on interneurons to indirectly activate the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn, that innervates the extensor muscles in the trunk and proximal limbs to help maintain posture. The medullary reticulospinal tract starts in the medullary reticular nuclei, which gives off an ipsilateral and a contralateral branch. Both branches travel through the ventral medial spinal cord, where they either directly or indirectly inhibit lower motor neurons in the anterior horn that innervates the extensor muscles in the limbs. They also synapse with interneurons that synapse on the corticospinal tract, forming a connection between the extrapyramidal and the pyramidal pathways, which work together to coordinate an activity like walking. Finally, the medullary reticulospinal tract regulates lower motor neurons that control breathing muscles like the intercostal muscles between the ribs. The lateral vestibulospinal tract assists in balance and posture. Changes in the body's posture are detected by vestibular sensory receptor cells in the inner ear, and these travel to the large vestibular nucleus in the pons and medulla. This information is then sent to the lateral vestibular nucleus located in the pons, which sends out motor neurons down the ventromedial spinal cord to synapse with interneurons in the spinal cord on the ipsilateral side of the body. Most of these interneurons activate lower motor neurons that control the extensor muscles in the legs and butt, but some also inhibit the lower motor neurons in the flexor muscles. So when you're falling over to one side, the leg muscles on that side will keep you from falling over. The rubrospinal tract originates in the red nucleus in the midbrain, and it assists with speed and movements. It immediately crosses over to the contralateral side at the ventral tegmental decussation, before traveling down through the ventral lateral spinal cord in the neck region, where they synapse with interneurons that activate the flexor muscles and inhibit extensor muscles in the upper limbs. It's thought to play a role in controlling movement velocity, and that's because damage to the tract causes a person's movements to slow down, like moving in slow motion. Alright, as a quick recap. Pyramidal tracts include the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts, which consist of upper motor neurons from the cerebral cortex, which activate lower motor neurons in the spinal cord and brainstem, which innervate skeletal muscles. Extrapyramidal tracts include the rubrospinal tract, the pontine reticulospinal tract, medullary reticulospinal tract, and lateral vestibulospinal tract. And these all indirectly modulate movement through interneurons which either activate or inhibit lower motor neurons.